You're standing before a time machine, not a shiny booth, nor a sci-fi vortex with spinning gears. It's a question, a thought experiment, one of those that makes perfect sense until it doesn't. Imagine you travel back in time, not too far, just enough to find your grandfather before he meets your grandmother. For some reason, accidental or intentional, you prevent that meeting. Or worse, you kill him. The question is simple, direct, and as sharp as a scalpel. If you prevented your grandfather from having children, then your father was never born. And if your father was never born, how were you born to go back and prevent him? That's the grandfather paradox, one of the oldest, and still one of the most troubling riddles of temporal philosophy. It's not just a narrative twist. It's a fracture in the glass of causality, an open wound in the idea that time can be bent without consequences. To grasp its weight, we must look closely at the chain of cause and effect we use to explain everything, from lightning to regret. When you break a link in the past, you inevitably alter all future links. But if that change makes the cause itself impossible, then the circle closes on itself and dissolves. Attempts to solve the paradox have generated various theories, some intuitive, others almost mystical. The first is the parallel timelines theory. In it, when you travel to the past, you don't change your own history, but instead create a new branch of time. So by killing your grandfather in that reality, you only prevent the birth of an alternate you, not the you standing there. It's an elegant solution, but it requires accepting the existence of infinite universes unfolding with every choice. A multiverse where everything happens, even the impossible. Another theory proposes that the past is immutable. You can go back, but you'll never be able to change events that already occurred. Perhaps you try to kill your grandfather, but fail. Or you discover that, unknowingly, you were the one who led him to meet his future wife. History protects itself from paradoxes, as if it had a will of its own. This idea of self-consistent time was defended by physicists like Igor Novikov, but that restricts free will. Are we mere actors following a fixed script? There are also those who believe that time travel is a logical illusion. Stephen Hawking once proposed the chronology protection conjecture, suggesting that the laws of physics would prevent any form of interference with the past. In other words, nature itself censors these anomalies before they can occur. But something deeper lies here, something that goes beyond time travel. The grandfather paradox isn't haunting just because it plays with dates. It touches on questions of identity, origin, and purpose. It forces us to ask, what makes me, me? A continuous line of events or something else? If you could change a key moment in your story, what would happen to you? Would you still be the same person? And if you could prevent a pain, a trauma, a loss, who would take your place? In psychoanalysis, there's a similar idea, revisiting the past, symbolically, to transform it. Freud spoke of repetition as the return of the repressed, the unconscious desire to relive in order to finally resolve. In that sense, the grandfather paradox is also a psychic mirror. Deep down, all of us want to rewrite what hurt us, even knowing that doing so might erase parts of who we are now. Philosopher David Lewis tried to treat time travel as a logically coherent narrative. According to him, events in time are like pieces on a board, and there's no contradiction if we know where each piece was, is, and will be. But even Lewis admitted, free will and causality enter conflict when time becomes a two-way street. And maybe that's the strangest lesson of the grandfather paradox. That time, as we understand it, may not be linear, may not even be real in the way we think. Gödel, yes, the same from the Incompleteness theorems, showed that under certain conditions in general relativity, closed time loops, where past and future cross, are possible, as if time were a circle, not an arrow. In that case, who came first, the grandfather or the grandson? The answer may never come, and that's okay, because the value of the paradox is not in solving it, but in placing us face to face with the instability of our certainties. It's a reminder that no matter how advanced our technology, our logic, or our language becomes, some things will always escape, and maybe they're meant to. And while we dream of time machines, perhaps the closest we ever get is remembering deeply, with pain, with longing, because remembering is also a kind of returning. And returning sometimes is where the paradox lives. Somewhere, anchored in the quiet of a museum or drifting on the sea of memory, there is a ship, old yet whole, familiar yet strange. It's called the Ship of Theseus. The story begins simply enough. Over time, the ship that once carried the hero Theseus is preserved with care, but wood rots, nails rust, sails tear, so one by one, its parts are replaced. A plank here, a mast there. Eventually, every single piece has been substituted. Not a single atom of the original remains. And yet, the question lingers in the air like salt over the ocean. Is it still the same ship? This is the paradox of Theseus, a puzzle as old as philosophy itself, but as alive today as ever. It begins with wood, but quickly sails into deeper waters. Identity, continuity, and the fragile thread we call the self. Some say yes, it's still the same ship. After all, the form, the design, the purpose endure. The name remains, the journey continues. Its identity lies in continuity, not in material. This echoes a concept from Aristotle. A thing's essence is not in its substance but in its structure, its function, its telos, its purpose. But others say no. If not a single part of the original ship remains, how can we say it's the same? Identity, in this view, is rooted in matter, in substance. The original is gone. This is just a replica, a well-made copy with a borrowed name. The paradox sharpens when we add one more twist. Imagine that all the old parts once removed were stored in a warehouse. Over time, someone decides to reassemble them, plank by plank, using the exact same pieces. Now we have two ships, one made entirely of new parts, the other made entirely of the original ones. So now, which one is the real ship of Theseus? Is it the one that stayed in the harbor, evolving piece by piece, or the one that was rebuilt from the very atoms that once sailed under the Aegean sun? Can both be real? Or is one an imposter? This is where things start to resemble us, you and me, because the human body too replaces itself over time. Most of our cells regenerate. Skin, blood, bones, they renew. In a decade, you are, quite literally, not the same physical being. Your thoughts evolve, your memories fade, your opinions shift, and still, you feel like you. Why? Philosophers and cognitive scientists have wrestled with this for centuries. John Locke suggested that personal identity is based on memory. You are the same person if you remember being that person. But memory is flawed. It fades. It changes. Does that mean identity is unstable, even illusory? David Hume went further. He argued that the self is nothing more than a bundle of perceptions, a flowing stream without a fixed core. If you search for a permanent self, he said, you'll find only fragments. And yet, we act as if we are whole. Modern neuroscience doesn't offer a clean answer either. The brain is dynamic, rewiring itself constantly. There's no central you inside your head, no single neuron that holds the soul. Identity, from that perspective, is a story the brain tells itself, and yet stories matter. Perhaps that's what the paradox of Theseus is whispering to us, that identity is not a thing, but a narrative, a continuity of meaning across change. The ship stays the same because we believe it does. You stay the same because your story holds you together. Even as your cells, memories, and beliefs shift, this idea has real consequences. Consider social identity. Nations, for instance, change laws, languages, borders, and governments, sometimes entirely, and yet they claim unbroken continuity. France is still France. Japan is still Japan. Even after revolutions, wars, and reconstructions, the name persists. The identity remains. But when does something truly stop being itself? When is the tipping point reached, where renovation becomes replacement and change becomes erasure? In the digital age, we face a modern Theseus paradox every day. Is your online self, curated, filtered, algorithmically shaped, still you? If someone cloned your mind into a machine, would it be you, or just your parts rearranged? The paradox doesn't aim to provide a definitive answer. It doesn't need to. Its power lies in holding up a mirror, one that distorts, reveals, and deepens. It asks, what do we really mean when we say something is the same? And what do we lose when we stop asking? Because perhaps the true identity of the ship of Theseus isn't in the wood or the shape, the name or the memory. Perhaps it's in the tension itself, in the question we carry, and the silence that follows. There's a donkey, alone in a field. On its left, a bale of hay. On its right, an identical bale. Same distance, same size, same smell, same everything. The donkey is hungry, very hungry, but it has no reason to prefer one bale over the other. So, It stands still. It looks left, it looks right, and it dies. Of starvation. Right there, between two equal choices. This is Buridan's ass, a philosophical paradox attributed to the 14th century French thinker Jean Buridan. It's absurd on the surface. Who dies just because they can't decide between two meals? But underneath the absurdity, something troubling emerges, a question about decision, reason, and the fragility of free will when logic leaves us stranded. At its core, the paradox asks, can perfect rationality lead to inaction? And worse, can indecision be fatal? In a world driven by logic, the donkey does the rational thing. It looks for a reason to choose. But since both options are equal, there is no reason. And without a reason, the system halts. No preference, no action, just stillness. Buridan himself probably didn't use the donkey in his writings. The image came later. But the idea he explored was real. The limits of reason when faced with symmetry. When everything is balanced, what moves us? Let's bring it closer to us. Think of a person with two job offers. Same salary, same benefits, same location. They analyze, they compare, they list pros and cons, only to find equilibrium. No clear winner. A week passes, then a month. Paralysis sets in. Eventually, both offers vanish. The person, like the donkey, remains stuck, not for lack of opportunity, but because reason alone offered no nudge. Now imagine society on a larger scale. Political systems locked in perfect ideological standoffs. Voters torn between equally unsatisfying candidates. Institutions that delay action because no side can prove it's better. In theory, this is balance. In practice, it's stagnation. So how do we break the tie? One answer comes from outside logic. It's called arbitrariness. Just choose. Flip a coin. Pick the left bail. Act without full justification. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas argued that free will must include the power to choose between equals, even irrationally, because otherwise we'd be paralyzed every time options seem identical. This arbitrary impulse is not a flaw, it's a feature. It's what gets the donkey moving. What gets us moving? Emotion, habit, instinct, things often dismissed as irrational, become vital tools when reason reaches its limit. Behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman, in his work on decision-making, showed how people rarely decide based purely on logic. We use heuristics, shortcuts, biases. Sometimes that leads to error, but other times it saves us from Buridan's trap. Even neuroscience suggests that decisions often begin before we're aware of them. Our brains light up with activity milliseconds before we decide. Maybe that flash of preconscious impulse is what pushes the donkey left instead of right, what pushes us forward at all. But there's another layer to the paradox, one more philosophical, even existential. What if the donkey knows both options are equal and still cannot act? What if awareness itself deepens the paralysis? Then we face a chilling truth. Sometimes the more we think, the less we move. Modern life is filled with endless choices. Streaming platforms, dating apps, career paths, diets, ideologies. Everything customized, everything optimized. And yet we hesitate. We swipe, we scroll, we freeze. Overchoice becomes no choice. Buridan's ass is no longer a fable. It's us, at the supermarket, trying to pick between 32 kinds of olive oil. Us, wondering if we should text back now or later, or never. Us, standing at the edge of opportunity, staring into the void of too many equal options. So what's the lesson? Maybe it's this. When reason stalls, movement matters more than precision. Progress often begins with imperfection. The best decision isn't always the most rational. It's the one made. And life, unlike the paradox, doesn't wait for logical closure. The donkey dies in the story, but we don't have to. We can move, choose, change directions later if we must. Because to act, even imperfectly, is to break the symmetry, to let life in, to say, I may not know the best path, but I refuse to stand still. And that, perhaps, is the quiet heroism of being human. Can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that even it cannot lift it? It sounds like a child's riddle. But hidden in its simplicity is one of the deepest and most unsettling questions ever posed about power, logic, and the limits of language. This is the Omnipotence Paradox, a centuries-old dilemma that asks, what does it really mean to be all-powerful? And can that very concept collapse under its own weight? At first glance, omnipotence seems easy to define, the ability to do anything, anything at all, no restrictions, no boundaries. But when you begin to press against that definition, when you test it, it begins to splinter. Let's return to the stone. If an all-powerful being can create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it, then there is something it cannot do. Lift the stone. If it cannot create such a stone, then there is also something it cannot do. Create it. Either way, something lies beyond its reach. So is it still omnipotent? This puzzle has haunted theologians and philosophers for centuries, not because they lack faith, but because they seek coherence. Can omnipotence include logical contradiction, or must it obey the rules of logic? The medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas argued that omnipotence does not mean the ability to do the logically impossible. God cannot make a square circle, nor a married bachelor, because these are not things at all. They are contradictions. To Aquinas, God can do all things that are possible, but the logically impossible doesn't qualify as a thing. It's linguistic nonsense. In this view, the stone paradox dissolves. The question is like asking if God can make 2 + 2 = 5. It's not a limitation of divine power. It's a boundary of language. But others, like Descartes, took a different path. He suggested that if God is truly omnipotent, then even logic itself is subordinate to his will. God could make 2 + 2 = 5 if he chose. Rationality is not a cage. It is God's creation. But this position leads somewhere strange. If logic can be bent or broken, then so can morality, truth, even identity. The very structure of reality becomes unstable. We're left with a tension. If omnipotence is bounded by logic, then it is limited. If it's not, then everything, including reason, becomes meaningless. Modern thinkers like C.S. Lewis echoed Aquinas. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis wrote, "Nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it about God." An all-powerful being, to Lewis, doesn't do the logically absurd because doing so isn't power. It's just error disguised as thought. But let's leave theology for a moment. The paradox isn't only about God, it's about power itself and the contradictions it brings. Can a government create laws it cannot override? Can a ruler give total freedom to the people and still remain in control? Can a mind imagine a reality so alien that it cannot comprehend it? These are echoes of the same question. Can absolute power coexist with self-imposed limits? And in our lives, we face this in subtler ways. A parent wants to give a child freedom, but also protect them. The more freedom, the less control. The more control, the less growth. Where is the balance? Or think of love. You want someone to stay freely, but the moment you force their presence, it stops being love. Real power, in this sense, may lie not in doing everything, but in knowing when not to do. Perhaps this is the deeper truth behind the Omnipotence Paradox. True power isn't in infinite action, but in self-limitation. A God who can do anything, but chooses not to violate logic or freedom or love, may be greater than one who blindly asserts might. The ancient mystics knew this. In some traditions, the act of creation itself is seen not as expansion, but contraction, the infinite withdrawing slightly, creating space for the finite to exist. Power, creating room for vulnerability. Even in physics, we see that not everything that is possible is permitted. The laws of nature place constraints, not out of weakness, but to allow structure, stability, form. Without limits, the universe would be chaos. So maybe the Omnipotence Paradox isn't a failure of reason. Maybe it's a doorway, an invitation to rethink what power really is. Is it the ability to do everything, or the wisdom to choose what should be done? Because in the end, perhaps the most powerful act is restraint. The stone never needed to be lifted. The question never needed to be answered, only understood. This sentence is false. 7 words. Simple, clear. But like a trap made of language, it catches you the moment you try to understand it. If the sentence is true, then what it says must be the case, which means it is false. But if it is false, then it's not true that the sentence is false. So it must be true. Round and round it goes. This is the liar paradox, a self-referential loop that seems harmless at first, but when unpacked, threatens the very foundations of logic and language. It's not just a curiosity, it's a crack in the mirror of thought itself. The paradox goes back to ancient Greece. The philosopher Eubulides of Miletus posed it as a challenge to our understanding of truth. Ever since, it has haunted logicians, mathematicians, and philosophers like a riddle that mocks those who try to solve it. At its core, the liar paradox is a sentence that talks about itself and lies. But how can a sentence describe its own truth value in a way that defeats itself? This isn't just wordplay. The implications are serious. In the early 20th century, the philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell confronted similar paradoxes in mathematics, where certain sets could or could not contain themselves. These problems seemed minor at first, but they exposed deep inconsistencies in the very foundations of formal systems. Russell's discovery led to a crisis in mathematics. If logic could produce contradictions from such basic statements, how could we trust any formal system at all? Later, Gödel would shake the ground even further. In his Incompleteness theorems, he proved that any sufficiently complex mathematical system cannot be both complete and consistent. There will always be true statements that cannot be proven within the system. And the heart of Gödel's proof, a sentence that essentially says, "This statement is not provable." Sound familiar? The liar paradox isn't just a toy for logicians. It's the shadow cast by systems that turn inward. When a language tries to fully describe itself, it folds. This happens not only in logic, but in human life. Think about trust. A person says, "I am lying right now." Are they telling the truth? If yes, then they're lying. But then, they're telling the truth? It's not just confusing. It erodes the ground beneath your understanding. Doubt creeps in. Not about the facts, but about the frame itself. In politics, in media, in relationships, this paradox emerges when metatruths appear. Statements about truth itself. Everything you hear is a lie. Don't trust what I say. Once that seed is planted, communication breaks. If the system discredits itself from within, what's left to believe? Wittgenstein wrestled with this. In his Tractatus, he proposed that language must be limited to describing the world, not itself. Once we try to use language to fully explain language, we reach the edges of sense. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. But that silence is hard to accept, because we live in a world built on words, on symbols, declarations, promises, contracts. And when language turns paradoxical, when it loses its ability to define what's true or false, we lose direction. So how do we live with the liar? Some modern logicians propose alternatives. Paraconsistent logic, for example, allows contradictions to exist without destroying the entire system. Others suggest multi-valued logics, where a sentence can be true, false, both, or neither. These are mathematical bandages, and they work to an extent. But they also acknowledge a deeper truth. Reality is not as neatly ordered as we once hoped. Perhaps that's what the liar paradox ultimately teaches us. That truth is not always binary. That meaning, especially when turned on itself, becomes unstable. That the mirror can't always reflect itself without shattering. And maybe that's okay. Because in a world obsessed with certainty, the liar paradox offers a strange kind of wisdom. Not everything that sounds logical leads to clarity. Not every sentence can be trusted, even when it speaks clearly. And sometimes the most honest thing you can say is that you don't know if what you're saying is true. Achilles, the swift-footed warrior, is ready to race. Beside him stands a tortoise, slow, steady, unhurried. But today, in an act of fairness, Achilles gives the tortoise a small head start. The race begins. Achilles runs with incredible speed. He quickly reaches the point where the tortoise was. But in that short time, the tortoise has moved a bit farther. Achilles runs again and reaches that new point, but the tortoise has moved again. No matter how fast Achilles is, the tortoise always remains just ahead. According to Zeno of Elea, Achilles will never catch the tortoise. And in that quiet impossibility, the world stops making sense. This is one of Zeno's paradoxes, formulated in the 5th century BCE, designed not to confuse but to challenge, to reveal the strange consequences of our assumptions about space, time, and motion. At its heart, the paradox asks, if space and time are infinitely divisible, how can movement ever occur? To reach the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the point where the tortoise started. But before that, he must reach the halfway point, and before that, the quarter mark, and before that, another half, and so on forever, an infinite number of steps. So how can anything move at all? This is the brilliance and the terror of Zeno's thinking. He didn't want to destroy motion. He wanted to defend a deeper idea. That change, as we perceive it, may be an illusion. Zeno was a student of Parmenides, who believed that all reality is one, unchanging, timeless. That motion and plurality are mere appearances. Zeno's paradoxes were arguments in favor of this view. If motion leads to logical contradiction, perhaps motion itself is not real. Centuries later, Aristotle pushed back. He argued that while the number of steps Achilles must take is infinite, they are also infinitely small and can be completed in a finite time. Motion is real, he said. The paradox lies not in the world, but in our way of slicing it. But the paradox remained. For over 2,000 years, it haunted thinkers, because even as our senses insisted that Achilles would overtake the tortoise easily, logic kept whispering that something didn't add up. Then came calculus. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz, working independently, developed the mathematical tools to deal with infinity. With the concept of limits, they showed how an infinite series of ever-shrinking intervals can still sum to a finite distance. Achilles can complete infinitely many steps, because the total time required converges. For example, 1, 2, plus 1 to 4, plus 1, 8, plus 1, 16, on 1. Problem solved? Maybe mathematically, but not entirely philosophically, because Zeno's paradox isn't just about motion. It's about how we experience reality, and how that experience can break when pushed to its limits. In modern physics, this matters more than ever. Quantum mechanics reveals a world where particles can be in multiple states at once, where motion isn't continuous but quantized, made of discrete jumps, like pixels on a screen too fine to see. Some theories suggest that space and time themselves might not be infinitely divisible. Another step, another requirement, another reason you're not there yet. It feels like progress is never enough, that arrival is always just out of reach. Zeno's logic lives not only in math but in emotion. Or think of perfectionism, the sense that before you act, everything must be aligned, that before you speak, your words must be flawless, that before you begin, you must be ready. But readiness is a horizon that keeps moving, and so you wait, you think. You divide time and intention into smaller and smaller pieces, until you never start. Zeno's paradox, then, isn't just a statement about motion. It's a trap of the mind, one we build for ourselves, piece by piece. So what breaks the cycle? Maybe it's action. Because in the end, Achilles does overtake the tortoise. Not because the logic is wrong, but because reality moves while we hesitate. Because the world is not made of frozen thoughts, but of bodies in motion. And motion, whatever its paradoxes, is still the only way forward. Tolerance sounds simple. It's the idea that all voices should be heard, that different views, beliefs, and ways of life can coexist peacefully, even if they disagree. In a civilized society, tolerance is not just a virtue, it's a foundation. But what happens when intolerance itself enters the room? Do we tolerate those who reject tolerance? Do we protect those who seek to destroy protection? This is the paradox of tolerance, introduced by philosopher Karl Popper in 1945, in his book The Open Society and Its Enemies. And it forces us to ask a painful question. To preserve tolerance, must we become intolerant? Popper saw what many ignored. In the name of openness, liberal societies often welcome ideas that seek to end that very openness. Hatred, fascism, extremism. They enter not with violence at first, but with speech, with claims of fairness, victimhood, free expression. And if these ideas are allowed to grow unchecked, Popper warned, they will not return the favor. A tolerant society, in tolerating everything, risks becoming the stage for its own destruction. The snake is invited into the house, and by the time you realize it, it's already swallowed the key. This is not just theory. History gives us vivid, brutal examples. The rise of Nazism in Germany was not through brute force alone. It was enabled at first by democratic systems that tolerated the intolerant. By the time those systems tried to push back, it was too late. The tools of tolerance had been used to dismantle tolerance itself. So what should we do? Popper's answer was clear, though often misunderstood. He did not call for censorship of all offensive views. He argued that when intolerance becomes active, when it begins to incite violence, dehumanize others, or attack the foundations of dialogue, it should not be tolerated. Not because we fear ideas, but because we protect the space where ideas can exist. It's a line that's hard to draw. Who decides what's intolerant enough? When does disagreement become danger? When does protecting democracy turn into suppressing dissent? These are not easy questions. They shouldn't be. But the paradox makes one thing clear. Tolerance is not passive. It requires judgment, discernment, boundaries. We cannot defend a pluralistic world by being neutral in the face of those who seek to destroy plurality. This tension plays out today more than ever, in online platforms, in public squares, in universities and governments. Free speech meets hate speech, protest meets propaganda, and we're left asking, where does tolerance end? Some argue, let everything be said, truth will win in the open. But history suggests otherwise. Lies, when repeated enough, do not fade. They become architecture. Freedom of expression can be weaponized to spread the idea that some voices don't deserve to exist. Popper's paradox doesn't offer easy rules. It offers a warning. Do not let the defense of freedom become the tool of its undoing. There's a deeper layer, too. Tolerance isn't just about laws or policies. It's about values. Can we truly tolerate if we don't understand? Can we coexist if we secretly hope the other side disappears? And what does it mean to stand for tolerance when it's uncomfortable, when it costs something? Because real tolerance isn't painless. It demands we live in tension, holding space for difference while defending the lines that make difference possible. It means allowing the offensive, but not the dehumanizing. It means enduring criticism, but stopping the incitement to violence. It means speaking not only for yourself, but for the others who might not be heard. And sometimes it means saying no. No, you may not use our openness to silence others. No, you may not twist freedom into a tool for domination. No, we will not stand by while the ground of shared reality is shattered. That is not intolerance. That is protection. Popper saw this not as contradiction, but as responsibility. Tolerance must be defended, or it will not survive. So the paradox stands, not as a trap, but as a guide. Be open, be generous, be brave, but do not be naive. Because in the end, a tolerant society is not one that accepts everything. It's one that chooses what it must not accept to remain free. It's raining, but I don't believe that it's raining. Read it once, and it feels grammatically correct. Read it again, and it feels wrong, deeply wrong. Not false, not nonsensical, just impossible to say sincerely. This is Moore's paradox, named after British philosopher G.E. Moore, who introduced it in the early 20th century. And though it sounds like a trivial oddity, it opens a window into something far more unsettling. The strange, fragile link between what we say and what we believe. Let's break it down. The statement, "It's raining," could be true. The statement, "I don't believe it's raining," could also be true. But saying both together, "It's raining, but I don't believe it's raining," feels absurd, not logically contradictory. You could in theory have a strange neurological condition where you say true things but don't believe them. The sentence could describe a malfunctioning robot or a person under hypnosis. But when you, a conscious speaker, say it sincerely, it collapses. Why? Because speech is not just about content, it's about commitment. When we say something, we are not just reporting facts, we're placing ourselves in relation to those facts. We're saying, this is true, and I stand behind it. So to say, "It's raining," is, implicitly, to say, "I believe it's raining." To immediately follow that with, "I don't believe it's raining," is like stepping forward and backward at the same time. Moore's paradox reveals that some statements are not logically impossible, but psychologically unthinkable, and that changes how we see belief itself. We often think of belief as passive, something that happens to us. You observe, you process, you believe, but belief is more than cognition. It's identity. It's posture. It's the lens through which we see and through which we speak. And when that lens cracks, when the belief doesn't align with what we say, the contradiction rings louder than logic can explain. Philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, deeply influenced by Moore, explored this idea further. He believed that meaning isn't just in words, it's in use, in the act of saying, the social context, the human expression. To say, "I believe it's raining," is not just to report a mental state. It's to position yourself within a shared reality. Moore's paradox shows what happens when that position falls apart. But it's not just a puzzle of language. It lives in daily life. Think of someone saying, "I know she loves me, but I don't believe it." Or, "I deserve happiness, but I don't feel like I do." Or even, "I'm fine, but I don't really believe I am. These are real sentences, lived contradictions, not logical paradoxes, but emotional fractures, where belief, knowledge, and speech drift apart. Moore's paradox is not a glitch in the brain. It's a mirror. And in that mirror, we see ourselves at our most conflicted. It also raises an uncomfortable question. Can we ever fully know our own beliefs? Imagine a politician declaring, "I support this policy, but I don't actually believe it's right." Or a person praying, "I believe in God, but I don't really believe I do." These are not logical errors. They are crises of sincerity. And perhaps the most dangerous version is this: I am being honest, but I don't believe myself. What happens when language detaches from conviction? When speech becomes habit, or performance, or camouflage? We live in a time of curated selves. Online, we express things we may not believe. We signal, we perform, we adapt. But somewhere beneath the surface, the paradox waits. The more we speak without believing, the more we lose the thread that connects words to truth. Moore's paradox doesn't threaten logic. It threatens authenticity. It tells us, you can say anything. You can even say things that are technically true. But if you don't believe what you say, the meaning fades. Not for others, for you. Because belief is not just about accuracy, it's about coherence. The quiet inner alignment between what you see, what you know, and what you admit out loud. So maybe the paradox is not a flaw. Maybe it's a compass. It reminds us that saying something is not the same as owning it. And that belief, real belief, isn't loud or performative. It's the stillness underneath your words. The quiet part that doesn't just say, "It's raining," but actually stands in the rain and feels it. A child has been taken by a crocodile. The parent, desperate, pleads for the child's return. The crocodile, strangely calm, speaks, "I will return your child if you correctly predict what I will do next." The parent responds with trembling clarity, "You will not return my child." Now the paradox begins. If the crocodile intended to return the child, then the parent's prediction was incorrect, and by the terms of the deal, the crocodile shouldn't return the child. But if the crocodile intended not to return the child, then the prediction was correct, and the crocodile must return the child. Either way, the crocodile is trapped in a contradiction. Whichever choice it makes, it breaks the rule it just created. This is the Crocodile Paradox, an ancient logical riddle, deceptively simple, quietly devastating. At first, it reads like a clever game of semantics, but beneath the surface, it opens a world of philosophical tension, between knowledge and action, between truth and power, between logic and ethics. Let's start with the structure. The paradox is built on self-reference, the same logical trap behind the liar paradox. This sentence is false, and Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Here, the parent's statement affects the event it is trying to predict. The act of prediction interferes with the future, like trying to measure a wave without disturbing the water. It's a feedback loop with no resolution. And that loop says something crucial. Some situations have no stable truth, because the truth itself changes depending on what we say. In modern logic, this is sometimes called an epistemic paradox, a conflict not between facts, but between beliefs, predictions, and outcomes. The problem isn't that we don't know what's true. The problem is that truth is being shaped by knowledge in real time. And that's not just a problem for crocodiles. In human life, we constantly make promises, predictions, and threats that depend on the responses of others. If you believe me, I'll do this. If you don't trust me, I'll prove you wrong. If you expect me to fail, maybe I will. These aren't empty hypotheticals. They shape real behavior. And sometimes, they trap us. Think of relationships. A partner says, "You don't believe I'll stay." But if they leave, the other was right and wrong. If they stay, the other was wrong and right. Trust becomes a paradox. Your belief affects my behavior, and my behavior affects your belief. This is where the crocodile paradox turns from logic to psychology, because what it really exposes is the fragility of trust, and how quickly communication collapses when motives are unclear. The crocodile sets a trap, but it's a trap built on ambiguity. It shifts the burden to the parent, asking them not just to hope or plead, but to predict, to gamble with their own child's fate. It's cruel, but familiar. We see echoes of this in bureaucracies, in justice systems, in politics, when decisions are made not based on need or ethics, but on procedural logic. We will help you if you meet these exact conditions. But what if the conditions respond to your answers? What if the rules change based on your behavior? Then you're no longer a participant. You're a pawn in someone else's logic. Even in AI and machine learning, we now face crocodile-like dilemmas, systems that respond to our inputs, while shaping their own future behavior around our expectations. The line between prediction and manipulation begins to blur. So, how do we escape? The Crocodile Paradox doesn't offer a clean solution. That's the point. It reminds us that some questions can't be resolved within the system that creates them. You can't win a game where the rules contradict themselves. Sometimes the only answer is to step outside the game. That's what philosophers like Wittgenstein meant when they said, "When language goes on holiday, reason must rest." It's also why Kurt Gödel's work matters here. He proved that any system complex enough to express arithmetic will contain statements that are true, but unprovable. There will always be things that logic can't reach. And perhaps that's the real terror of the crocodile. Not that it lies, but that it tells the truth in a way that logic can't hold together. So what do we do with paradoxes like this? We recognize them for what they are: warnings, signals that something has broken, not in the facts, but in the frame, not in what's being said, but in how it's being said, and why. When a system demands an answer to a question that can't be asked sincerely, when a person insists on logic while ignoring the human, when rules trap instead of protect, we are all the parent, and we are all the crocodile, caught between belief and behavior, between what should happen and what must. And in that tension, we're left with the real paradox. Sometimes the more rational the rule, the more inhuman the outcome.